Welcome to the Going Green podcast. Today we're going to have a look at Drought Dominoes. It's not the latest game to sort of hit the PCs and arcade machines. No, it's looking at basically what happens with a drought and the knock-on effect of a drought. Yeah, we see droughts and people say, yeah, okay, we've got a tub. We talked about these before. This is basically a hosepipe ban.
Yeah.
And no problems with those, really. And gradually the UK is going to get more and more of those. But basically, we're looking at today the knock-on effect of a drought.
Yeah. So one of the things that most important to look at is, yes, you've got your drought happening, but there are sort of what we know as a direct effect. So drought, lack of water, and you can go down that rabbit hole of chain of events, like dominoes, or you can go via the indirect consequences of a drought. These are the ones that you've got your nice chain of dominoes firing down, causing things. But then every domino doesn't hit another one. It hits splits into three, and those then send down different chains. And it basically sort of you turn from one domino knocks down, suddenly a pattern sort of appears. And we're sort of saying, it wasn't a direct effect of being knocked over. However, it's now causing us problems in the long term of, well, not necessarily in the long term, but in the very, very short term. And it's
over the next few years.
Over the next few years, it's going to cause us issues. And we're talking, these are things daftly like the ground's going to be less fertile, so that the next year's crop yield, if we, they manage to get going, they're going to be less. There's going to be a smaller crop yield from those. And then, of course, that leads then directly into less food output. It's those sorts of things that you don't ordinarily think of having a drought causing.
Okay, so let's start by having a look at direct effects. So we've got so far a simple problem that we've got less rainfall, and less rainfall basically doesn't necessarily mean a drought, but it's because not we've got less rainfall now, and we haven't, some counties haven't had any rainfall in July, and we're now in August and they still haven't had any rainfall. Paul and I went out for a walk, and we went down to the local park, and we looked at a picture last year and a picture this year. Last year we walked in a green park. We walked in sort of dead sort of grass park this time.
Well, yes, it wasn't, but it's not the shocking contrast between this year and last year in the same month. It's the difference of what a month makes. We've just seen, stepping out pictures from May, June, and now August, and you're seeing that their ground is so much,
it's drier. It's getting worse, isn't it?
Getting worse and worse. And, it's silly things like you can see the earth is baking and cracking, and it's getting crunchy underfoot, showing that sort of the moisture that was a little bit there. We're talking a foot down is now gone, and now sort of is just dry earth.
And of course, if we now have any rain, the problem is the ground is so hard that the rainfall doesn't generally seep into the ground so much as it runs off, and we can get something we see very rarely in this country, a flash flood. So this is what we are talking about, this domino effect. Once you have one thing, then it sets up a line of other things to happen. This drought hasn't been happening for the last month or two. It's because we actually had quite a dry winter, and we had a dry spring. We did have some rain, but not as much as normal. So therefore, the water table was basically not as high, and gradually we're seeing the reservoirs getting lower, the sources of rivers becoming sort of nearer the
Yeah, they're getting. I would say.
exit.
Yeah, I was going to say they're getting shorter. Like they're reporting that the Thames is 5 miles shorter, and because it's from the source and it's coming down, and the source has moved. If that makes any sense, but
Well, our local river, we went down and had a look at the River Gade, and the River Gade is often sort of 6 foot wide, and we were looking at it in some place, it was just a foot wide. It was flowing still quite fast, but some of the most lush vegetation we were finding now in the river sort of itself, as opposed to sort of either side of it. And you are seeing a little bit of area either side of the sort of river still being sort of quite sort of green, but generally move away sort of a few, well, sometimes even a few feet from the river, and it's a lot drier. So let's think of some more direct effects on these domino effects of the drought. So we're thinking then the farmers are now not getting enough water on their fields, so therefore the crops, they will grow, but the yields are going to be way down.
well, yes,
So let's look at an indirect effect now. And the one I will give you is there's less wheat to sell. That's fine. But there's actually less wheat then for seed for next year. And that's our indirect effect.
yes, absolutely. What I'm reading here is, of course, very simply, it relates very heavily. Is that ranchers, so not farmers? So this is more animal farmers, right? Unfortunately, we'll have to spend more money on feed and water. Okay, which leads to the fact that food or not necessarily grains and wheat and sort of those sort of things, but actual animal products go up.
But that's a direct effect,
That's a
isn't it?
direct effect. Okay, so suddenly now they're going to cost more. Except, of course, everybody's trying to squeeze all the money out of everybody, and so what might actually happen is that grain, or more precisely feed for animals, becomes too expensive for those farmers or ranchers to actually have the animals. So unfortunately, they cannot. The economy doesn't work for them, and so they unfortunately have to get rid of the animals.
And if there are less animals,
And
there's less.
Exactly. So it's one of those things where, although the indirect effects are usually, they're very much the same. There's less there's something less of this, then that means they can't go back, and and that is unfortunately pretty much what the indirect effects look like all the time.
But another way of looking at an indirect effect is the farmer is, as you say, spending more money on water and feedstock because they can't go out and sort of eat lush grass. So he hasn't made as much money, so he can't buy a tractor at the end of the year. And that then affects the tractor industry. So they're now going to suffer, not this year, but next year, because the farmers won't have as much money to spend on new tractors. And so that's a indirect effect of this drought. Well, let's have a look at some more direct effects of this drought. So lack of water, and we've got hosepipe bans, and we've touched then on food shortages, because basically everyone's going to have to try and sort of do something else. And with the drought, we've also got the heat as well.
Yes.
And that's also not helping, because we, Paul and I went for a walk yesterday down in our local town centre, and they've got some fountains there. One of these sort of on the pavement fountains that sort of shoot water up, and the little kids of about 5 or 6 were having a whale of a time predicting when the water's going up. Now, as we walked past, we could notice how much cooler it was in the vicinity of that sort of little fountain and its effect. It does have a cooling effect. So we've got not just ordinary heat, but if you've got the same temperature, ambient temperature, it actually does seem a little bit warmer if you've got less sort of green plants, which are sort of cooling things down.
Yeah, the thing they like to say is, yes, there is shade, but sort of moisture is trapped in that because it can't evaporate. That's how, and so having more water in the atmosphere, basically not higher humidity, because that's the wrong way to describe it, but basically more water actually around does keep the temperature down, because of course the water there is absorbing the temperature and the heat.
And it's got high specific heat capacity.
Right, exactly. And that means, of course, that then evaporates, taking the heat away, as opposed to the heat on us. So that's the story. But
So,
one of the
yeah, go on.
But one of the critical things, of course, is if there is a hose pipe ban because of less water, right, that fountain will have to be turned off. Now, that means the kiddie winkles can't play in it. I'm not saying that.
Direct effect.
Which is direct. But one of the major indirect places is, of course, then there is less places to not retreat to. That's the wrong way to put it. But, you're always in the sun. You're having to basically find the shade, essentially. And so, which causes people not to go out and people to basically not be stressed by this, but sort of, then having problems of, I need to go and dot between the two pieces of shade and attempt to go somewhere.
I always like our council, when it does get very hot, what they do is they close the paddling pools, because then they say the ground's too hot for the kids to run around barefoot.
And the answer is, well, it can get that hot. It can, but not obviously that hot. It's just one of those things where, it can happen, and I can understand why, but it's a whole sort of argument of what do you take. But this thing of sort of doing all these shade things of heat stress, that could be quite a lot of problems to people in relation to anxiety, depression, or sort of can't be bothered attitude and those sort of things. So, that's one of those boring, or not say boring, but those are one of the indirect effects of this drought.
Right. So let's have a look at another direct effect. Lack of water and higher temperatures and more sunshine means that this country is now suffering the problem that basically Europe suffered from last year in America, and that is wildfires. And we are getting wildfires. In the last little heat wave, we saw several wildfires, one very serious one, which did its damnedest to actually wipe out a village.
Yes.
And lack of water was a big problem there, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. It was major. It was after catastrophic in the area. And so one of the things that are happening is, as I say, wildfires are prominent. They can happen. They can, spontaneously appear.
Or helped.
Well, this is the point I'm making. Lots of councils, as well as doing hosepipe bans, are banning disposable barbecues.
Which is a good idea,
But they're also selling to supermarkets to stop selling the disposables. If you stop access, no one can buy them, right? To help that way, which is not an inconsequential effect, but it's one of those things where, because there's these bans on disposable barbecues, who the maker of disposable barbecues, suddenly they're been told, they've been selling loads because everybody wants barbecues, and then suddenly, no, we're not selling barbecues, so suddenly they're out of money.
So there's your direct and indirect effect.
But the other major point about sort of all the wildfires and all those sorts of things is actually how much money there is to not prevent, but to put out the wildfire, and sort of how much that an intervention as opposed to prevention. It's huge.
Well, you've got another problem there, that if you're firefighters, that we've got enough firefighters to cope with generally all the fires that are going on around the country, and that's how the economics work. But now we've got new fires, new wildfires happening, and that is now stretching the fire brigade beyond its normal limit. We've got a fire brigade that's designed to protect the cities and do the occasional wildfire, I suppose. But now we're finding that we've got more wildfires, and they're so easy to set light to. It doesn't have to be deliberate, although there have been a few. I know in the last little sort of drought, where my niece lives, they were worried about kids using these little balloons with a little flame underneath them, and they were setting them off, and they were hoping they were going to land in a field and set it on fire.
Yeah, it struck.
They were stopped by the police,
Yeah,
fortunately. Yeah.
So it is one of those things where, preventing fires, as they say,
Yeah.
only you can prevent forest fires, but we're talking about wildfires. But anyway,
But
all right.
what gets one of those fires going? It doesn't have to be someone with a disposable barbecue, although that can be a source. It doesn't have to be someone smoking and throwing away a lighted cigarette. It can actually just be something like a piece of plastic. So you've got a little piece of plastic, rubbish, if you like, around packaging, around something, and that blows away. Someone doesn't pick it up, and then it acts like a lens.
And and the lens magnifies, causing the fire to appear. And there you go. There's your wildfire. So we're not saying all wildfires are caused by negligence, but it is sort of negligence in recycling that the people could have thrown their rubbish away. This is why they do say, make sure you do pick up your litter. And you think, oh, that's all, make sure plastic's not in the environment, but it's actually so that plastic isn't in the environment, which could cause problems down the line. All right. Here's another very fascinating direct/indirect effect. Ready? They've closed lots of the canal systems in the Midlands, and we've got lots of canals all over the place, right? And they've had to close them because, of course, water shortage all over the place. Which, fair enough. That's a fairly constant, direct sort of, right? Now, a lot of people lived on the canals or living on the canals. That's fine. But of course, they can't now move how they used to. They can't travel anywhere. They can't go upstream or down. They can't go anywhere. That's inconsequential.
So that has a direct effect of their mooring fees. So
Yeah.
if they move their boat and stay somewhere just for sort of 2 or 3 nights, then no fees are payable. If they sort of moor longer than that, then that's permanent moorings, and they get charged for that. If the canal is such that they can't sort of zip up and down and sort of turn round, then they've got problems, and that's because the water levels are getting low. Some of our canals actually act like rivers. Next to the canal, or the canal is a river, but then when the canal gets to a height difference, we'll call it a lock, then running by the side of the lock is an overflow. So when the water's going down the lock, great. But when the water isn't going down the lock, then the water can go round the side. And that way we move water from places like Wales down to where we need it in the south of England.
Yeah.
Because there is less water in the south of England, and moving water is difficult. But if the canal now is so low, then it's not managing to pass that water down. So they're not then moving huge amounts of water around. And that has a direct effect on the water companies, that now they've got to actually ship that water some other way.
Yes, and that's problematic that way with all the problem of those things. Another consequence, which we saw, is, of course, in the River Rhine. Now, the River Rhine, huge river in Europe, right, has been getting lower and lower because of the drought conditions in Europe, to the point where vessels are having to not ditch its cargo, they're just not having to put their cargo on the river, and they're trying to say losing 75% of all their cargo capacity so that the ship can still travel along the very shallow part of the river. Essentially, they've got to have minimum or maximum 1.5 displacement, because otherwise they'll get beached, and that's problematic in all.
Then they can't move any stuff. Yeah.
And so the problem there is that they can't move. They can only move a quarter of the stuff they used to move. Now, economies of scale and sort of getting goods elsewhere and transporting them. You're now talking huge inefficiencies of sort of going sort of almost like a detour instead of just pulling down the river, which of course has a knock-on effect of suddenly now your goods will go up because of course the transport's gone up. And you can suddenly see how the dominoes appearing from that directly. And it's the same in the UK, admittedly not as much transported by river, but of course think of all the dockyards where they're not tidal and boats go up and container ship land. Loads of smaller cargo ships that go around the coast, they actually go more upriver, and therefore they have the problem of suddenly there isn't much water to sort of help them fill. Let's say they're going for a lock. This is a lock like canals, right? It's the time it takes to fill the lock because they've got to lower and raise it, and they have to drain it from the water upstream. If there's less water upstream, then of course it takes longer to, and that compounds all the problems and those sorts of things.
So there's your direct effect and your indirect effect. Your direct effect, lack of water. The indirect, it's going to take longer to sort of move your boats.
Yeah, and that's not a problem in regards to the fact that sort of moving boats around their pleasure craft, but when they get to the commercial, it's a problem. The other.
So we're also looking at, while you're talking about lack of water there, we're looking at destruction of where the fish live, the habitats, and the wildlife. They're all being sort of severely affected. That's a direct effect. The indirect effect, of course, is the poor old fisherman can't go out fishing, and
and
he's not paying his dues then, is he?
No.
So the sort of water companies are also getting another one, a double whammy.
Yeah. So you can draw all these direct effects and conclusions from sort of a single point, and you can sort of say how everything's interlinked and the chain of things. But that you can see that in this interconnected world, a single problem, lack of water or this drought, and suddenly you're realizing that how integral things are, and it's boring things. It's like how much water is currently trying to be diverted, not to say hydroelectric dams where they're generating power, but to nuclear ones to avoid not saying nuclear, like Chernobyl. I'm not saying that at all, but it's sort of because we're needing the power for electricity, because we're needing all these extra things because we haven't got, how much AC is on, get your fans out. We need more power, and therefore the nuclear powers need to work a little bit harder. But they also need more water to generate that power, and suddenly there's less water, so they're having, do you sacrifice drinking water or water for power? And that's the problem.
So this country doesn't have that problem because all our nuclear reactors are actually built by the sea, and we're not looking at the sea levels changing. It's just fresh water that we're experiencing the problem with. And what we don't have in this country is any way of taking seawater and doing anything with that. Why? Because we've got plenty of fresh water. At least we did have until this year. Yeah. But we can also look at another problem that we've got in this country, that it's still raining quite a lot in Scotland. And, I was looking at the map, and we're in the south of England, quite low on the sort of the amount of water that's come, rainfall. But in Scotland, they're doing about normal.
Yeah, they've got normal. What was it? I read one thing.
But they can't move that water from Scotland down to England because we don't have the water infrastructure, because we never needed it. There are terrific amounts of water in this country. Like I was reading about sort of Loch Ness. Loch Ness has got more water in it than the whole of the amount of water in England and Wales combined.
It was something daft. It was quite a spectacular number. And yet the answer is, well, why are we not using that water? And maybe
because we never needed to.
we never need to. So surely a solution to all these drought problems is that, build a canal from Scotland down into England, or
Yeah,
I would
but
say via Wales.
canals seem to work well going downhill. As soon as you make a canal go uphill, then you need to get water from another source.
Well, look,
So that doesn't work. It's got to flow downhill. And I know Scotland is sort of uphill from England, but it's further north. No, there are more mountains. But if you look at something like Loch Ness, it's virtually at sea level.
yeah, it's sea level, isn't it? That's one of the hilarious things
So-
about Loch Ness.
It's power required then to pump it. And if you need power to pump, then that's more renewable energy we actually need to try and get that to go. So, yeah, let's have a look at some more dominoes, and we can look at some of those. We've got then, we've been talking about some of these sort of drought dominoes, the sort of economic ones, how the farmer then probably can't buy a tractor later on. We've mentioned the environmental effects, that we're losing things like wetlands. We've got more wildfires. We are getting a lot more erosion, of course, as well. But the last area is social impacts. We've got the direct problem of here lack of water, but the lack of water can affect people's health. And I was looking at some research on this, and it was showing that not just lack of water, but it's also temperature. The warmer it is, but also the drier it is, then that's also affecting lots of diseases. Not just one, but loads of diseases spread much better when it's warmer. And so that's got a social and probably a health impact on people as well. We are looking at a lot more health problems because basically drier, they're all more related to dust. Paul, you enjoy the pollen immensely, don't you, when
I
it's
know,
sort of...
it's awful. But you think people then asthmatic, they got problem with all the dust. I know we haven't got dust from the Sahara blowing up the red sand, but instead of being the Saharan dust causing problems, we are just talking just normal dirt. How it's baked off and the wind erosion blowing.
Yeah, well, when we were walking in the park, instead of walking on grass, you're kicking dust up. And when I got back, I was wearing sort of open-toed sandals, and I had sort of, well, very sort of dirty feet. You could tell I'd been out walking, sort of, they were looking sort of decidedly grubby. And that then meant more water I had to use to actually wash and clean them up. Let's look at other problems, though. We've got, with lack of water, that also can affect the water quality.
Yes.
And I don't think that's really this country.
No, it's not directly this one, but the problem is what they have an issue is in the continent is they're piping up, I say drilling up, and the piping, sucking up water from the ground, right? And that's fair enough, but of course they have to then clean it. Now, do you clean it or not? And that's what they're having problems of. Is not the fact that sort of where river water is generally very clean. It's them going, so they don't process it that heavily. They're now having to get groundwater, which of course is dirtier, but they haven't got not the infrastructure, but they're not cleaning it because it's just going through the normal system. And therefore that's bringing in all those problems of lowering the water quality out there. And that might affect problems of people's health, all sorts of issues in relation to that way. You think of all the minerals in all the pipes that are suddenly now coming through. They're all consequences of what they're doing by having these sucking up the water from the ground aquifers as opposed to pump them from the rivers, because of course they've got no more water. And so suddenly, it's an umming sort of, do you once again give people water to drink, or do you sacrifice and say we can't pump from there, but then we got problems of having water for people to drink?
That's why France, some people in some departments are limited to sort of just 200 litres of water a day. Yeah, big problems. You've been listening to the Going Green podcast. We've been talking about drought dominoes, the effect that drought has on different things, really, all sorts of aspects of life. And we get something we're going to have to live with. Next time, we'll have a look at another topic, although I have a feeling this one about drought isn't going to go away, and heat waves. So we'll see what we're going to do, and we'll see you next week on Going Green. Until then, it's goodbye from me.
And a goodbye from me.
Bye-bye.
Bye.